So everywhere I go, people ask me some variation of the question, can they do that? Deborah Pearlstein, welcome to the first ever installment of Can They Do That? You are a constitutional law professor who is now the director of the Law and Public Policy program at Princeton, and most importantly, for the purposes of this conversation, an expert in presidential powers and executive orders. And I asked you to have this conversation with me because right now, everyone wants to know all about executive orders. So can we start with, what is an executive order?
Yeah, absolutely. Firstly, thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be here. And I get that, can he do that question a lot these days. An executive order is really not more than a piece of paper that the executive with his staff writes down, here's what I want to happen. It has the force of law for the executive branch. It can't make people outside the federal government do anything. What an executive order does is instruct federal agencies and people who work in the executive branch what to do next. So it has the force of law. It gets published in a thing called the Federal Register. That's what an executive order is. Presidents have been issuing them since literally the beginning of the country. George Washington issued executive orders. Every president comes into office and issues at least some, because that's the way presidents say, I want these people in these positions. As a particular form of law, they're not so surprising. There's nothing wrong with them. They've just been...
In the abstract, right?
In the abstract.
Okay.
This time around, we're just seeing some that are pretty problematic.
So let's go back. I want to go back at another time. Let's talk about historically how they've been used. But even before we talk about the use of executive orders historically, I think one thing that confuses a lot of people is if you go on whitehouse.gov, for example, and you go to the news portion of the site, you can see a variety of things that are labeled presidential actions. But not every presidential action is an executive order. For folks who are sitting out there thinking, how do I know when an executive order has been issued versus a presidential memorandum or a proclamation? What's the difference between all those different things that a president announces or proclaims, and what makes an EO different from some of those other things?
Yeah, so as a practical matter, the difference between an executive order and a memorandum and a proclamation can be nothing in effect, right? They're all different forms of orders to people in the executive branch, or can be. The real difference is executive orders have the force of law, right? Memorandum is an instruction that the president issues, but it doesn't get published in the Federal Register. Proclamations are often more ceremonial or directed at individuals, but not always.
But sometimes not, right? Like you and I have talked about,
yeah.
One of the most famous executive orders of all time is the Emancipation Proclamation.
Although that was called a proclamation, right?
Right. But does it function the way an executive order would in our modern era? Probably, right?
So that particular example is a particularly complicated one, but yeah, proclamations, including, you can find some on the .gov site, the White House site right now, can be in effect exactly like an executive order. Some of the list of what we call executive orders that Trump issued in his opening days were called proclamations. Some of them do that because the statute that gave the president the power to do that in the first place said the president can issue a proclamation. It's really more a matter of, it's mostly a matter of style, less a matter of function.
When we're talking then about what differentiates President Trump and his use of executive orders from other presidents, I was surprised in preparing for our conversation to learn that FDR, for example, issued more than 3,200 executive orders. Now, granted, he was in office a whole lot longer than his successors, but what can you tell me about the ways that President Trump has deployed executive orders, and are they in fact different in form or substance or degree than those who have preceded him in the office?
Yeah, I think there are a bunch of differences that I think are important, but the first and most important one comes from this really straightforward principle of constitutional law, which is no president can do anything he doesn't have the power to do. And presidents get their power from one of two places. They can get it from the Constitution, or they can get it from a law that's passed by Congress. And so traditionally, every executive order starts with, by this specific power that's been given to me by either a provision of the Constitution or a law passed by Congress, or sometimes both, I am ordering the following. The executive orders that are most troubling that have come out of this administration are the ones that are either vague about what powers the president is actually exercising, or simply not clear that the president has the power to do that at all because it's against some other provision of the Constitution, or it's simply not within the president's power to do. So that's one of the big things that folks like me worry most about in this raft of executive orders. Not that he's issuing a lot of them, but that some of them are really not lawful one way or another.
And is one of the reasons that concern exists is because of when we talk about separation of powers, we're also talking about which powers are sort of allocated to X branch versus Y branch. My understanding is that there are some in your line of work who look at these executive orders and say, wow, for lack of a better description, that's a big power grab by the executive branch at the expense of another branch, typically the Congress. Can you explain a little bit more about that concern and how that's driving how some people are reading these executive orders?
Yeah, 100%, right? So it's sort of basic civics, certainly constitutional law 101, that Congress has the power to make laws, the president has the power to execute them. One of the central, in fact, the first power that Congress has in this giant list in the Constitution is the power to spend, the power to tax and spend, right? And that's subject to much debate, but there's never really been any debate that Congress's spending power is its central power, the power of the purse, right? That's primarily what it does. And what the president here seems to be doing by instituting these so-called pauses, but they're really cutoffs in spending, is violating Congress's power of the purse under Article 1. If Congress doesn't have that power, we're really not a separation of powers system anymore. We're really a system in which whatever the president wants is what's going to happen. And that's what's got so many constitutional law professors so worried.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate with you for a second and just put on my law nerd hat.
Yeah.
If you had to explain sort of what constitutional theory is driving a different interpretation, the interpretation that the president has much broader powers than those that are specifically enumerated to him in the Constitution, how would you describe that school of thought? I've heard it described as unitary executive theory or something similar to that. But like, again, for those of us who haven't taken Con Law 101, I've taken it, you teach it. How would you express or explain that to folks?
So let me distinguish between the orders and the memorandum that seem to cut off spending, which go way beyond any existing sort of conservative or unitary power theory of the executive. That's
and we'll
just
come back to
new.
this, right?
That's just new and improved or not, as the case may be. The unitary executive theory has been around since the 1980s, right? It's a creature of sort of conservative constitutional thought. And it says the president has the power to control all people and personnel within the executive branch, no matter what Congress says. So when Congress tries to create what have been called independent executive agencies and limit the president's power to fire the heads of those agencies, right? What's called the president's removal power. The unitary executive people would say, Congress can't do that, right? The president alone has the power to hire and fire these people, and he can do it for any reason, even if they're doing a great job, right? There are a few things in some of these executive orders that sort of speak to that idea of unitary executive theory, right? Questions of, there's one about the weaponization of the Department of Justice, right? In the last post-Watergate, half century, there's been this really clear principle and set of laws that have kept Justice Department decision-making independent of the president's political or partisan goals, right? The unitary executive theory would challenge that idea, and you can see that idea in some of these executive orders now.
You talked at the beginning about how executive orders have been a thing since time immemorial, been used since the beginning of the presidency, but clearly they're more of a, for lack of a better description, they're a thing now that they haven't necessarily been in recent memory. If you and I were just going to talk about sort of the modern presidency, and by that I mean our living ex-presidents, what would you say accounts for the rise of the use of executive orders? And can you track it like an upward trajectory that just keeps moving without dips and valleys? Or is it a little bit more complicated a story than that if you're tracking, let's say, from Clinton through Trump 2.0?
So I think there's been a steady trajectory of the increase in the modern years, right, of the use of executive orders. And the attraction of them for a president is pretty clear. You can think about it as executive order theater. It sounds great, and it sounds like on day one you are doing all kinds of things, and particularly in an age where Congress is polarized, right, and it's very difficult to get legislation passed.
Well, wait, let me stop there for a second.
Yeah.
Is it, in fact, that difficult to get legislation passed? Because some of our viewers might be watching at home and saying, President Trump is a Republican who has remade the Republican Party in his own image, who now has 2 houses of Congress dominated by Republicans, albeit one with some slim majority. But is it really that difficult to get legislation passed if you're him?
So certainly when there's separated parties, right, in control of the different branches, it's tough. But even when it's the same party, it can be tough, right? So in the first Trump years, when he comes in and he has control of both branches of government, and he's campaigned on, we're going to repeal Obamacare, right? We're finally going to get rid of it. When it comes right down to the final vote, John McCain, a member of the Republican Party, famously says thumbs down, and he can't get through even that Congress, right, his central feature. So presidents have struggled with this even with their own parties. There's no question it's easier now. But part of the attraction of trying to do things by executive order is you don't even have to, or you can try to not even fight that fight. Right? So there are 2 attractions. One is you don't have to go through the fuss and muss of going through Congress and following the actual ordinary constitutional course of events. And the other is you can appear to be doing a lot really fast. Sometimes you actually can do those things, but often it's more about the theater of sitting at the big fancy desk and signing it and telling other people to go do stuff later that may or may not actually happen.
Do you think the popularity of executive orders is in part accounted for because there also isn't concomitant pushback in the courts or otherwise? In other words, does it become more attractive for people to engage in this executive order theater because you don't have a robust Congress or other parties necessarily looking to litigate the validity of the action you took? I can think of a couple of actions taken in the first Trump administration that were done by EO that were challenged and maybe successfully at first, but it became this, if at first you don't succeed, try again. I'm thinking about the Muslim travel ban in particular, where through a series of iterations of those executive orders, they finally got what they wanted. It might not have been as perfect in their view as the initial executive order, but ultimately speaking, was there an executive order that accomplished some of those policy objectives? There sure was, and it was upheld.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't mean to say it's all theater, right? It's absolutely not. And Presidents Obama, Biden, Trump on both occasions, frustrated by a recalcitrant or just polarized Congress, right, have turned to executive orders when they can't get anything else done. And immigration is a great example of that. Congress has failed for 30, almost 40 years now to pass any actual immigration reform. And presidents have increasingly used power, usually delegated by Congress, like through the Muslim ban, to try to accomplish their own policy goals themselves because there are actual problems. And the part of the constitutional institution that's supposed to solve them isn't doing anything. And those have absolutely been regularly challenged in court. Not just the immigration ones, right? But you can think of executive orders to do with student loans. Yeah. You can think a lot. Those have shown up in the courts with increasing frequency, unsurprisingly, because they're used with increasing frequency.
I want to be fair when we're talking about it. I'm glad that you raised the student debt executive orders because some people might point to that as an example of sort of the expansionist use of executive orders by people of the other party too, right? Do Democrats use executive orders as aggressively as we've seen from President Trump? And if so, is there still some degree of difference between that deployment?
Yeah, there's no question that we've seen some really what I would call aggressive uses of the executive order or the executive power in order to accomplish what should be legislative goals, right? We not only saw that with the student loan, for example, under the student loan program under Biden, for example, under Obama, famously, we saw it with the deferred Action for Right Citizens. So the DACA, the so-called DACA program, right? So it was an effort to give something like immigration amnesty or some form.
I don't think people remember that DACA was created through an executive order of the same type that we're talking about right now.
Right. But all of these examples that have been used in sort of really aggressive ways by both Democratic and Republican presidents in the modern age are at least attempts to apply power that Congress has given the president expressly, one way or another. Right? So even with the Muslim ban, whatever one's views of the policy and otherwise constitutionality of that kind of order, the president was invoking a particular statute, a particular law passed by Congress that says the president has discretion to decide who can come into the country, right?
Right, so the issue there wasn't so much a question of presidential power, it was where does that presidential power collide with other constitutional principles that other people might be trying to vindicate through litigation?
Yeah, how much power was Congress really trying to delegate, and does the president's particular exercise of that power in this instance violate other laws or other provisions of the Constitution, right? Part of what we're seeing here that is so different in the new Trump administration are executive orders, including the executive orders sort of cutting off or pausing funding for USAID and other agencies, is that there's no real even attempt or pretense in these executive orders that the president is trying to apply any power that Congress has delegated or anything other than the president can do this because he's the president, right?
So in that way, it's sort of like a Nixonian principle animating what's going on here?
These are just power grabs for power that Congress clearly wasn't trying to give the president, and the Constitution doesn't give the president, and that's why so many constitutional law professors, at a minimum, are so worried.
We've made a couple of references to specific executive orders that Trump has issued since he became president again. I want to talk about them now more explicitly and discreetly and play a game with you, like a little bit of a lightning round game.
Okay.
And talk about which buckets we might put some of the more famous or infamous examples from the last couple of weeks, what buckets we might put them into. And I will tell you, I've come up with 3 for your application. Okay? One is what we'll call lawful but awful. The second is OMG, that's so blatantly unconstitutional.
Right.
And the third would be, eek, it's complicated. So let's talk about 2 in particular that have gotten maybe an outsized amount of attention, but for good reason. First one being the executive order through which Trump pardoned the January 6th convicted felons and or dismissed the cases of those who had yet to be prosecuted. What's your call on that?
Yeah, that one, I have to say, lawful but awful. Lawful in that the Constitution really clearly gives the president the power to extend pardons to people who have committed federal criminal offenses. That's the power that we saw Biden exercising quite a bit at the end of his administration. It's the power we've seen the new president assert, especially in this sort of sweeping order that applied to 1,600 people who were convicted in connection with the January 6th riots. Awful in that these convictions were deeply investigated, hard fought, clearly proved, and established by either juries or plea agreements beyond a reasonable doubt, and involved an offense that went to the core of what the rule of law means in an electoral democracy, right?
But at the end of the day, irrespective of what one feels about the merit of the January 6th prosecutions, wholly within President Trump's authority to issue these pardons, correct?
Awful, but awful.
Okay, so let's then go to maybe the other side of the spectrum. There is an executive order that, as of February 19th, I believe, says that the country will no longer grant birthright citizenship to people who are born in this country who have non-citizen parents or parents who are not lawful permanent residents. And obviously, I've just shorthanded what that executive order says.
Yeah.
What bucket does that one go into as far as you're concerned?
I think you called it the OMG, that is not constitutional
Sorry.
bucket.
I'm betraying the Valley girl that I am.
Which is not a technical term under constitutional law, but nonetheless, absolutely fits in that bucket substantively, right? The Constitution is rarely as clear as it is in the first sentence of the 14th Amendment, but the first sentence of the 14th Amendment says everyone born here is a citizen. Pretty much, period. Now, we can get into the sort of particular arguments that this administration now wants to advance, and I'm sure will, because this is already being litigated in the courts. But that is not an argument that, you know, is accepted or has ever been accepted in constitutional law.
And we're talking about the argument that they're making is that there is another phrase in the 14th Amendment that says that just being born here doesn't confer citizenship on you if you are not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. There is an interpretation of that phrase, as I understand it, that the Trump administration believes would allow them to deprive certain folks born in this country of citizenship. Is that your understanding as well?
That's my understanding of the argument that they're making.
Fair enough.
Right?
Why doesn't that work?
That argument is wrong for a host of reasons, because not even they would say, because they can't, that immigrants who are in this country are not subject to its jurisdiction. In order to be able to deport somebody from this country, they have to be subject to our jurisdiction. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the authority to deport them. But more obviously than that, right? People who commit crimes, who are immigrants, are subject to criminal punishment in the United States every day. This administration, above all, wants to rely on those criminal laws to prosecute immigrants who they believe are doing bad acts in the United States.
That's the basis for sort of taking some of these folks and moving them to the new migrant detention center at Guantanamo, correct?
Which is a whole other topic we should talk about. But at a minimum, we, the government of the United States, can't do any of those things. Prosecute immigrants, deport them, or anything else, unless we take the position that they are subject to our jurisdiction, which we do.
Okay. Let's talk about one that I think gets people in both of our households very excited, which is TikTok. My children, I will confess to you, cheered the night before the inauguration because as far as they were concerned, President Trump is responsible for restoring TikTok to the populace of the United States and should be widely praised for that. Putting aside the fact that politically this was a win for him, I'm going to ask you a different question. There is an executive order that's about TikTok. How does that fit in to the TikTok sort of sell or ban statute that Congress passed that was supposed to go into effect on January 19th? What does the language of the executive order say? How does that relate to the statute? And then what of my buckets would you put it into?
Right. I'm going to take the last question first, which is this goes into an it's complicated bucket. So it's going to take a minute to sort all that out.
Okay.
But I want to start by saying this executive order, above all of them, is a great example of what I meant by executive order theater, right? It said the law did something that it didn't, and the executive order by itself accomplishes essentially
nothing. Let's unpack
nothing.
that for a second. When you say it said that the law said something that it didn't, what do you mean by that?
So the law that Congress passed that had huge bipartisan support that's been called the TikTok ban doesn't ban TikTok. There's nothing in the legislation that says we're banning TikTok or even anything like it. What the law said is that ByteDance, which owns TikTok, right, has to sell TikTok by a certain date. And if it doesn't, not that TikTok is banned, but that the companies, the American companies that host it, Apple, where you can go on their app and download the TikTok app, right? And the servers that host it in the United States will be subject to fines up to $5,000 per user for all those in the United States who continue to access TikTok through their tech app or whatever it is, right? That's what it does. It imposes a fine. That law is still on the books. No executive order by a stroke of a presidential pen can take that law off the books.
Can I pause there for a second?
Yeah.
That's true of any executive order, right? No executive order can wipe the slate clean of a validly enacted, congressionally passed statute. That's what the veto is for. You get one chance of doing that when you are president. If you're presented with a valid enactment of Congress, you get to exercise your veto. But short of that, you don't get to, through executive order, be like, hey, I don't like this law, so let's just pretend it doesn't count.
Right. So back to the beginning, the president can only do something if he has the power given by the Constitution or by Congress. And that means that the president can't do something Congress has said you can't do. Congress can't, right? Congress gets a chance to say, you know, we're delegating you this power, or it can say not. But the president can't override an act of Congress purely by the stroke of his pen.
So what
he has
does
to
the
comply
EO
with
purport?
Congress.
So what does the EO purport to do, and how does it conflict with the TikTok statute of use, as you have just explained it?
Okay, so the TikTok statute says we're going to start fining these companies if they continue to carry this app after January 19th. Those fines are accruing as we speak. All the executive order did, that Trump issued, was say, I'm not going to start prosecuting or executing this law for the next 75 days. I'm going to wait, right? I promise you I won't punish you yet.
And is that a directive to the Attorney General, to the Justice Department to hold off on that?
It's a directive to the Attorney General that says, don't enforce any of these yet. Let me figure out what I want to do.
And can a president say to an Attorney General, this is a law that I want you to desist from prosecuting?
That's where it gets complicated.
Okay.
Right? So the president, everybody agrees, has the power to set broad law enforcement goals, right? There are all kinds of federal drug laws on the books. The last administration said, you know, in the scarce resources we have for pursuing federal criminal prosecutions, I'm going to put pretty low on the totem pole the federal law still on the books that says marijuana possession is a crime. We don't think that's a super high priority. We're not going to spend a lot of time and money prosecuting it, right? That's a generally agreed level of discretion for executives to use, right? What would be clearly unconstitutional at sort of the other end of the spectrum is the president saying point blank, I am not going to execute the laws that Congress passes. That's because the president has not the power, but the duty under the Constitution to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. There's a lot of room and a lot of uncertainty in between those two extremes, what counts as faithful execution. But a president who says, I don't like that law that Congress passed, I'm just never going to enforce it, would clearly create a massive constitutional imbalance, and to the extent he pursued it endlessly, a constitutional crisis. This executive order is on the line of, is this just sort of discretion, or is this actually tilting into the realm in which the president is failing to take care that the laws are faithfully executed? And I'll make, if I can, just one last point on that. All that does, because it's completely unclear whether that executive order would actually be upheld or respected by a federal court because its constitutionality is so uncertain, is give something like a promissory note to these major companies that are accruing billions of dollars of liability every day that the law is on the books. And that's why you cannot, if you go to the Apple App Store, download TikTok right now, because Apple's not taking that bet, right? Apple, the giant corporation, is thinking, well, after 75 days, he might start enforcing the law. After 5 years, which is when the statute of limitations run, and there's a new president in office, the new president could come in and enforce the law back to the time they began violating it. And Apple, which after all has obligations of its own to worry about, is not interested in taking the gamble that this maybe not constitutional order that the president just issued is going to spare it billions of dollars of liability that it may accrue for violating the law that's still on the books.
Fair to say then that there are instances where an executive order might have dubious or questionable constitutionality. Congress is not going to be in the position of saying, hey, we're going to litigate this one with you, but there are private people out there who are affected by it, who might themselves change their own behavior in reaction either to the executive order or to the threat that a particular law is still going to be enforced.
Absolutely. And here we're about to skirt the edge of constitutional law, and I'm going to hand you over to a corporate law professor in a minute. But the short answer is yes, publicly traded companies have shareholders, and they have fiduciary and other legal responsibilities, right, to not throw the company away, right? And shareholders, the people who hold stock in that company, right, have various causes of action. They have the chance to sue if they think a company is violating their basic obligations under the law, right? So if I were Apple and other giant corporations that worry about that kind of liability, that's exactly what I would worry about. It would be litigated under some aspect of corporate law that you need another expert to talk with about. But it would still raise as a defense or one way or another whether the promise that the president made through executive order is one that could be enforceable in court or one that a company could reasonably rely on, right, in continuing to do something that was manifestly against the law Congress passed.
Well, let's talk about something that could be more directly challenged in court. You mentioned earlier there is an executive order outstanding that freezes all foreign aid spending for 90 days. That would encompass all sorts of assistance that the United States gives to its partners overseas and even to countries that we don't consider necessarily our partners overseas. That, as you've just explained it to me, comes right up against the power of the purse given to Congress in the Constitution. How does that fight, assuming that somebody wants to have that fight, how does that fight play out and where does it land? In my buckets. Let's go back to my buckets.
Right. So that I would put that probably on the OMG, this really isn't constitutional bucket, but slightly on the edge of it's a little complicated. And that's for that reason. If the president issued an order that just said, I am cutting off all foreign aid spending, right, you would say, oh my God, that's totally unconstitutional. And this executive order, the one I think you're describing here, comes really close to that. What the executive order says is we're pausing foreign aid spending. And the administration would say that word is important because we're not violating Congress's power of the purse. We're just pausing. We're going to revisit this.
When we talk about executive orders that could be more directly challenged, you mentioned earlier that the power of the purse is one of the things that is most consequentially given directly to Congress in the Constitution. And yet we've got an executive order that puts a freeze or a pause on all foreign aid spending for 90 days. And it's incredibly broad. When I think back to my buckets of lawful but awful, OMG, blatantly unconstitutional, and it's complicated, where would you put that freeze on foreign aid spending?
I'm going to give you a total law professor answer, which is it's right on the edge between OMG, unconstitutional, and complicated. I'll say why that is.
Okay.
Right? A straight up cutoff of funding that's been authorized by Congress would be OMG, that's unconstitutional, right? The administration would like to argue here, it's complicated. We use the word pause. We're not cutting off or ending spending because the president has and agencies have some discretion to impose pauses or enact pauses like this. We'll get there eventually, right? They're trying to say. And there's
wait a second, though. Aren't pauses, if not legally problematic, at least politically hugely problematic? I mean, I am, old enough to remember that in 2019, the reason for the first Trump impeachment was a pause or a hold on federal spending to Ukraine because now President Trump and then President Trump tried to condition the provision of that aid on the initiation of an investigation into the man who became his successor, Joe Biden. That was the thrust of impeachment one, was that very conditioning and the pause itself was an abuse of power that the president was given. So is the pause in fact legally problematic? We know that there are members of Congress who would say, whoa, this is politically scorching hot. But how would you analyze the pause itself from a legal perspective?
It's absolutely legally problematic. And the only question is, does it violate the Constitution itself, or does it violate the law Congress passed called the Impoundment Control Act that says if you're going to pause spending for any reason, you have to do it this way? And indeed, there are only two reasons you could lawfully do it, neither of which is at issue here. Again, this is one of those executive orders where they're not even really trying to do it legally. They know how they could, but they're not even trying. The Impoundment Control Act, which was passed by Congress after Nixon tried exactly the same thing. I don't know if I want to spend money this way. I'm just going to stop spending it, right? That was where we got the idea of impoundment.
But would you say this is executive order theater? Because it seems to me, from where I sit and from where people in my line of work sit, that there is a real world impact already with respect to the freeze of federal funding, right? We can hear some of our partners around the world say, hold on a second, the failure to provide us with the aid on which we are depending, that Congress has already appropriated, on which we are counting on having delivered into our coffers, is going to be a significant impediment with respect to our ability to defend ourselves, our ability to ensure the health and safety of our citizens, to prevent communicable diseases like AIDS and HIV. So what would be your response to that?
This is absolutely not executive order theater, right? I use that expression to mean a lot of sound and fury doing absolutely nothing. This is an executive order that the president issued and the agencies immediately, as is their wont, started complying with by pausing spending, right? That's why we're seeing these very frightening real world effects that we're seeing. But it's one thing to say these can have and are having immediate real world effects, and another thing to say, yeah, these are going to hold up once they're tested in court. And they've already been tested in court twice in two courts that have pending cases that are about different aspects of different spending freezes that were put in place following these executive orders. And so far, the administration is 0 for 2, right? One sweeping temporary restraining order that came down almost immediately.
And you're talking about the restraining order against that director from the White House's Office of Management and Budget that really referred to federal spending across the board, wasn't limited to foreign aid, was really a much more across the board, hey, stop, take a look, catalog what's going out the door, and make sure it all stops until we understand what it is that you're sending out and for what reasons.
Yes, but the court absolutely additionally made clear, I'm not just talking about the OMB memorandum.
Right.
I'm talking about any of these executive orders or anything else you call it, right? The court uses almost exactly that language. Whatever you call it, to the extent you think it's, or the agencies think it is designed to stop spending, stop doing that. I think that's almost certainly illegal. We'll sort out the details, but for now, stop. And at least in the initial 24 hours after that order came out, the smoke signals from the administration were they're complying.
Well, that's a good place for us to land. Deborah Pearlstein, you've been an invaluable resource, and I have the feeling we will be talking to you a lot more about executive orders in the weeks and months to come. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.